Welcome back to Intesa Sanpaolo On Air, the English language insight series jointly hosted by Intesa Sanpaolo and the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this episode we explore the business of art. And what a business it is. Art is now very big business. In its Arts Global Market Report 2023, the business research company estimates that the global arts market size grew from $441 billion in 2022 to $580 billion in 2023. This growth is expected to continue, reaching over $680 billion in the next 3 years. Many things are driving this growth. First, we as consumers are falling in love with culture all over again. Post-COVID, it seems that we are revisiting museums and historical sites and attending cultural events and concerts at a much higher rate than we used to. On top of that, companies and institutions in the art market are innovating fast, using AI and augmented reality to create incredible immersive experiences for visitors and consumers of arts. And art galleries are also experiencing a boom in trade as collectors from all over the world fall in love with the idea of owning something beautiful. The business of art has a long history. Today's museums have their heritage anchored in the practices of the past. To understand the business of art, therefore, we need to go back in time.
I am Paul Roberts. I am the research keeper in the Department of Antiquities at the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology in Oxford University. It's always been a business. For the Romans, it was a business, as well as being a way of showing your wealth and power. There has been the transactional side. There has been also the political side of art, hand in glove, really, with the financial side, with the business side.
Back then, the trade in arts started with conquest. Paul Roberts explains.
Individual generals would conquer an area of Greece or Turkey or Egypt, and they'd bring back all these wonderful sculptures, silver and gold plate paintings. Some of them they'd keep for themselves, but many of them they would sell on. There were large auctions established formally in the city of Rome. You had areas, great colonnaded marketplaces, which would be specifically for auctions, and other places could be pressed into service as auction places.
Who were the buyers of this loot?
There were famous collectors of art. Cicero is a collector of art. He actually asks a man, one of his agents, to go and find 2 beautiful marble panels to set into his walls.
And of course, some of the greatest collectors of all were the emperors themselves, who used their wealth to demonstrate their power, but also to buy political favour.
A marvellous example, Nero. Nero toured the Greek East, and when he wasn't performing in the theatre, either singing or chariot racing, he was stealing, looting works of art by the wagon load, and they all come back into his Domus Aurea, his golden house.
And that is the origin of the museums that we see around us today.
The Romans, they had their temples of the muses. Temples were, apart from being places of cult, of course, they were also treasure houses, because the emperor or the aristocrat who dedicated it before the emperors would fill it with works of art. So you'd have sculptures by Phidias, you'd have gems. The Temple of Concord in the Roman Forum even has elephants made of obsidian, of naturally occurring volcanic glass, given by Augustus. So it's incredible to think of all these different temples as having, of course, their religious function, but they are also museums. They are temples of the muses as well.
So, while art was anchored in the pleasures and desires of important individuals, It in reality has always also been an institution of statehood. This idea of munificence, of allowing art to be enjoyed by the masses, has been a power move ever since Roman times. Take the Medici, one of Europe's finest and most powerful families in the Middle Ages, whose influence was created, reinforced and celebrated through their extraordinary support for the arts, including, of course, the great Michelangelo.
The Medici were obviously a wealthy family, landed, a banking family, a papal family. They were, in every sense, the heirs of the emperors. And you have the example of the emperors, because in the Renaissance you have had the massive rediscovery not only of sculpture but of the ancient texts, and they see themselves very much as successors of the emperors. They're shown sometimes in imperial clothing, in imperial armor, and so they are in many ways the new emperors. And it's not surprising, therefore, that they amass collections of art.
And it was not just in Italy. Elsewhere in Europe, in centres of wealth like the Low Countries and Britain, collections were being created by banking families and traders. A couple of hundred years later, in what Paul Roberts describes as a pre-Enlightenment Enlightenment period in the early to mid-1600s, the Earl of Arundel put together an amazing collection in Arundel House in London, which went on to become one of the main collections in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Prestige lay at the heart of all this.
It is a demonstration that you can fill your house with beautiful sculptures and other works of art. Arundel had a lot of different works of art, the gems, things like that. But it's bringing people into your home and they see these sculptures. And what that does, it's rather like the Medici, it sets you up as the heirs to Rome. You fill your home with the vestiges of Rome, if you like. And that, in a sense, imbues you with Romanitas. And that is something very desirable, because England is embarking on its imperial venture.
At some point, perhaps with the arrival of the age of the great explorer, came the named exhibitions, the Burrell Collection in Glasgow, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford. Why was that significant?
One major turning point, I think, is when you have a parallel existence for these collections, where you have these collections which are formed by and sometimes still in the hands of these wealthy lords, but they become wholly or partly public. That is a real turning point, rather than the way in which they're collected or the ethos behind their collection. It is the way that they are made open. And that is a revolution.
In 1685, the Ashmolean becomes a museum open to curious persons. 70 years later, in 1753, the British Museum opened. This period saw the beginning of what has become known as the Age of the Grand Tour, an age where over the next 250 years, big homes across Europe started to open their homes to the general public for the first time to similarly curious persons. From that time, as the modern state enters the art business, the state was able to put on public display artefacts from its activities overseas, not just from privateers operating on their own accord, but also from the state's activities as imperialists. On show in these museums went artefacts brought back from expeditions around the world, a practice echoing that of the early Roman emperors living some 2,000 years before. And the state was not just a passive actor, it actively sent out adventurers to grab what they could find from specific missions.
When you look at Britain, especially the 17th and the 18th century, you have this phenomenal wealth from land, from industry, and it's reflected in the private houses. In the Victorian period, it's also reflected in the public buildings, the munificence that we saw before. But of course, it isn't restricted to Britain. You look at the collections that are amassed in Prussia, in Germany, the collections that are in the Louvre. You have these often by imperial personages, but by the counts, by the lord, by the equivalent of the lords in Prussia.
For the state, such museums presented its people with a window on the world. They wanted to show the power of their state, their reach, of course, but it was also driven by a real desire to educate the population. Museums therefore popped up outside of the capital cities too. It's tempting to think that regional museums were an early form of levelling up, a way to encourage tourism across the regions. Not so, says Paul Roberts.
The catering for tourism is quite recent. And the mass tourism that we see is the past 20 years. Oh, definitely. And I think this is true also of continental Europe. When I think personally of the difference in crowds between 2000 and now, the difference is extraordinary. And the Italians actually have a word for this over-tourism that we're experiencing now. It's straturismo. Straturismo. Stra means too much.
It seems that the pandemic is very much to blame for this problem. While tourism was certainly on the rise pre-COVID, staycations have remained at high levels post-COVID, adding volume to the return of international travellers. So, is curating for tourists different to curating for local visitors?
You don't give any less care to the objects that you are looking after. You still ensure that they have optimum conditions of storage, of display. But when you're putting together a display, when you're putting together an exhibition, a book, you will consider how this can be most appealing to the greater number of people.
This new curation has made popular art forms that traditionally were either not valued or underrepresented in state-owned spaces and large houses. In particular, it's paved the way for a more mainstream appreciation of contemporary and modern art in society. This makes sense. For art to become the catnip for the masses, it needed to embrace culture that reflects our world today, not just some idealised version from classical civilization. Paul Roberts.
There is a private museum in Mougins in the south of France. And that museum, until recently, had the most gorgeous display of ancient art. That is now being sold through an auction house in New York. And it's reopening as a museum of the woman in art. And this is a very interesting development because you have, I think, in this period, this 20, 30 years that we've been going through now, we are seeing, I don't say the end of interest in classical collections, not at all, because there are so many wonderful classical collections out there, but you have seen the inexorable rise of the appeal, both in terms of society and in terms of finance, of modern and contemporary art.
So why does contemporary art confer status?
Having a Banksy on your wall, you are making a statement. Not only that you are au fait with Banksy and you know what he is, in the same way that in the Roman world, you had your Greek mythology on the wall. You were cultured.
One of the more fascinating things that I unearthed during my research into the business of art today is that corporations are also involved in art as benefactors, as investors, or as owners and stewards of important historical treasures. To get into this, who better to go to than Intesa Sanpaolo, which as a bank has one of the most important collections of art preserved from its long history, as well as a clear strategy to support art and cultural institutions in Italy. Intesa Sanpaolo states on its website that it is committed to 4 societal goals: innovation, the environment, inclusion, and culture. Under culture, the bank states that we promote culture and art to foster social cohesion, enhancing and offering the public access to our important artistic and historic works while working to protect cultural assets. I cannot stress just how unusual this is in the corporate world. Intesa Sanpaolo, it seems, regards preservation and promotion of Italian excellence as part of its mission, its reason to exist.
My name is Laurence Aliquot, and I am head of promotion, marketing, and cultural partnership for Intesa Sanpaolo Group.
Intesa Sanpaolo has more than 35,000 works of art in its collections, the result of several mergers over the years. More than 500 mergers, in fact. In 1992, the bank took the decision for the first time to enter the museums business, opening its first museum in Vicenza, 50 miles inland from Venice, and then its second in Milan, called the Galleria Italia. But what were these buildings before they became museums?
Actually, they were banks. And we did transform those buildings into museums. So, of course, it's a huge symbol because it was the place of the power. It was the place of the economy of the city. And so I think it's a very strong symbol that we did transform those important places.
Laurence Aliquot. So, for Intesa Sanpaolo, cultural institutions created networks and connections across Europe, while at the same time opening these important and historic spaces and collections to members of the public, and especially their customers, for the first time.
Italy has the most important cultural and art heritage. It's obvious that the idea of Intesa Sanpaolo is that we want to share. We want to give the opportunity to share our collection, to share culture. And as the first bank of the first Italian bank, we do believe that we also have a social role. And of course, we have a cultural role. We realize that we can have a strong impact on culture and art. And of course, that's a win-win for everybody, because if you have a better society, if you have people who can be able to have culture, to receive culture and know-how, of course, they're going to have the better possibility to give you also a better economy. And a better economy is better for the banks.
There is value in the business of art for Intesa Sanpaolo beyond engaging with customers. Employees too find this part of Intesa's mission very appealing, and it makes them proud of the work they're doing. Laurence Aliquot again.
We are a huge company and we are an international company. And sometimes it's difficult to imagine exactly what we are, since we're coming from so different entities. I told you that we're the result of so many mergers. And sometimes that you could feel that you're not belonging to Intesa Sanpaolo. But then you see what Intesa is really doing. And they are using also what was belonging to your bank you're coming from. So it has this great power to be able to give this unique feeling of belonging strongly to something.
Today, Intesa has 4 galleries in Vicenza, in Milan, in Naples, and in Turin. Turin in particular is interesting because it is a museum dedicated to photography and digital art, featuring exhibits from an archive of more than 5 million images of Italy from 1930 through to 1980. Today, these museums are regarded as vitally strategic elements within Intesa Sanpaolo's business strategy, bringing communities together for the benefit of the community. It was also clear that these were becoming places of innovation. I asked Laurence Aliquot what she meant by that.
So where things happen, let's put it that way, and where the public, where the visitor, usually, when you have a visitor coming into a museum, sometimes, and some people just don't go to the museum because they're not feeling okay, because they have this idea that culture is something that is only for for some people, for some part of the population. On the contrary, what we want is have culture for everyone. So everyone has to feel home when they come to the museum, and they have to be part of the museum. So becoming from passive to active to protagonist of the museum belongs to them, not to us.
Any discussion of the business of art needs to address how art is valued. Auction houses, art galleries and individual collectors place value on paintings and sculptures, in some cases in the many millions of pounds. The most famous of these is the Salvator Mundi, a painting attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, painted in the 1500s, which sold at auction by Christie's in 2017 for $450 million.
I am Melanie Gerlis. I am the art market columnist and writer for the Financial Times. There are some tangible pieces of value. So there are some, if you have a Leonardo da Vinci, a big name artist or a famous artist, and then within that, there will be certain periods that art historians have deemed the best. So those are kind of tangible aspects where you can ascribe a value. Size, normally the bigger the better, or the bigger the pricier, I should say. There are certain colors. There are some mad surveys that show, if it's red does better than yellow and green does appallingly. So there are a few tangibles. I would say that accounts for about 10% of art's value. Everything else is perception, zeitgeist. I like this artist because he came from the same country as I was born in. It is really quite personal. What it says, I think most people buy art because of what it says about them, and we're all individuals.
So why do we spend money on art, Melanie? What drives us to spend our hard-earned money on an adornment?
I do think the highest proportion or the highest incentive for people to buy art is, this says that I am XYZ. Now, over time, for a while, if you were a Victorian, you were buying art that showed that you were progressive and you were pro the Industrial Revolution. And so you would buy the artists of your day. You often find contemporary art, which is also the case now, actually, that contemporary art is very popular with newer money. It's saying, I am getting rid of the past. I don't believe in the old ways of doing things. And then you get periods of time when people are a bit more reflective and want to look back and want to buy art that shows that they're clever, maybe, or scholarly. So they will buy a Rembrandt print or something that takes a little more effort than I like the look of it. And obviously people also buy, people buy art because they like the look of it. You can buy lots of things a lot cheaper than just art for the look of it.
Is the valuation game a perfect science? Can you rely on the word of the seller as to the value of a given piece? Melanie Gerlis argues that the art market is structurally flawed.
One of the reasons it's a flawed market is it's a bit of an insider market. So in a way, a dealer's job, a normal, run-of-the-mill dealer, is to buy cheap and sell high. And they are going to know information. There is an asymmetry of information. They are going to know things that you and I don't know. At the same time, there's a bit of what I call a Charles Saatchi fantasy. Charles Saatchi in the 80s and 90s bought hundreds and hundreds of new artists, young artists, straight out of art school. And you still get, if you go to graduate shows, you get people going to graduate shows and just picking up loads of works in the hope that one day these people will become the next Damien Hirst, as happened to Charles Saatchi. It's, again, I equate it to gambling. Good luck. You'll have more fun trying, maybe, than with gambling. You'll meet a lot of artists. But I think you could buy 100 works. One of them might go up. It might become the next best thing. There's still the cost of the other 99. So you'll probably end up net zero, but hopefully have a lot of fun trying.
Wow, this sounds to me pretty much like how a venture capital market works.
I often equate gallerists, for gallerists who represent young artists, new artists, I often equate them to private equity or hedge funders in a way, because what they are doing is not only buying the artist, but helping to make them successful. So they're kind of invested in an artist's success.
Today we have the emergence of huge international art gallery brands, the so-called mega galleries like Gagosian, Hauser & Wirth and David Zwirner. These galleries have become highly visible, highly successful and are extremely high status in the art business world.
Galleries have been around for centuries. I would say the model we are used to in the UK is probably come out, like quite a lot of our museums as well, and art fairs. The model has come out of the Victorian period, when I guess people had more leisure time, is what was happening then. And one of the leisures they could enjoy was owning art. And this is where the gallery came in. The mega gallery is a modern phenomenon, and it has come about really since, in the 1960s in New York, there was a gallerist called Leo Castelli who looked after artists such as Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, artists who became, the abstract expressionist artists as well, who became incredibly popular and are now incredibly pricey. They're at the top of the priced tree in the art market. And everyone kind of wanted to emulate Castelli.
So a mega gallery can sell out an entire exhibition of one artist immediately. Indeed, Melanie explained to me that sometimes mega galleries pay out a signing fee for an artist to come to them, making art galleries something akin to football teams. And some of these high-end spaces can rival museums in how they curate and present art. Why then, in our digital world, do artists, especially world-famous ones, need galleries at all? Why not just put all your works online, on Instagram, and take all the proceeds of the sale? Melanie Gerlis.
The problem is you don't really know what you're getting. And I actually think the more stuff there is out there, the more Instagram accounts, the more websites, the more you can do things without an intermediary. Actually, in the art market, the more need there is for an intermediary, because sifting through, editing, knowing what it is that makes the art worth that amount of money is quite, as we talked about before, that the notion of value is, it's not like buying a wine and you say, well, it's from this year, it's from this vineyard, I like the grape or whatever it is. There are no consistent measures when it comes to buying art.
Beyond Instagram, of course, museums and galleries are using technologies such as virtual or augmented reality to both dramatise what is on display, as well as creating new forms of tech-inspired artwork. This is such an exciting space, but it also comes with ethical challenges and questions around the IP and ownership rights of any art created.
I have a 14-year-old son who would not come with me to a museum, but if I said to him, do you want to look at a museum through VR? He might give it a go. He might look at a Leonardo da Vinci and learn something that way. The other thing to remember is that if you enjoy the experience of art, you enjoy it with other people. Then you chat, you have a coffee, you make a day of it. There's a community.
So who in their right mind would go willingly into the business of owning galleries? Well, one answer can be found in the ownership of some of the world's most famous auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's. I asked Melanie Gerlis for her view.
An auction house is a brand. It's like a football team. They're going to attract international businesses, individuals who are looking for trophy assets. So at the moment, you have, Christie's is owned by Francois Pinault, a wealthy individual. Sotheby's is owned by Patrick Drahi, a wealthy individual. So they're just, they're slightly playthings of the rich, I think.
When it comes to ownership, though, the ownership of the art itself is the thorniest issue. In the last few months alone, 2 major rows have broken cover, between Italy and Germany over the ownership of the Discobolus, and between Greece and the UK over the Elgin or Parthenon marbles. This is a complex issue, and I wanted to start with some history. So I came back to Paul Roberts of the Ashmolean to ask whether the Romans worried about things like repatriation.
If the Greeks did call for them, we wouldn't know, because their appeals probably wouldn't be preserved.
One such example was the Emperor Tiberius, ruling in around 20 AD, who had to give back treasures after a public outrage.
Outside the baths, one of the public baths in Rome, was a beautiful sculpture of an athlete scraping oil off his body with a strigil. So after a race or a fight, he's scraping the sand and the oil off. And this was on public display at the baths of Agrippa. And Tiberius took a shine to the sculpture. He was an interesting character, and he put it in his bedroom. He wanted this athlete in his bedroom. And the next day, when he went to the theatre, there was a riot. The Roman people rioted. They said, "Give us back our Apoxyomenos, give us back our Apoxyomenos." And he had to put it back in the baths. So there was a great public awareness of the importance of this art.
But this did not see the artefact returned to its place of origin. This did not happen often in the Roman world, but there is one example, which is of the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick, which was taken from the temple in Jerusalem by the Emperor Vespasian to the Forum of Peace in Rome. It stayed there for 400 years before the Vandals from Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, sack Rome and take it back to Carthage. The emperor in Constantinople then sacks Carthage 40 years later and takes the menorah back to Constantinople, and from there the Emperor Justinian returned it to Jerusalem. Complicated? You bet. I come back to the FT's Melanie Gerlis for her view on the question of repatriation, especially in light of the current disputes around ownership of these important historical pieces. She agrees that it is complex, but that this is where open lines of communication can produce creative solutions.
I think it takes some proper, unfiltered, if that's possible, research into exactly why a Benin bronze is in Oxford, for example, and really looking into that, really looking into the claims that people have, because yes, there is some ambulance chasing, but I would say the majority of claims at the moment have a really fundamental reason. There are arrangements. Yes, the British Museum has looked after the Parthenon or Elgin marbles, depending on what you want to call them. They've looked after them beautifully, but there is an argument they shouldn't have them. Yes, the Greek museums have got much, much better over time, and they want them, and they have a right to them. Let's just discuss if there's a third way. And I think there's a lot of resistance to discussing third ways at the moment.
The third way that she mentions include, by way of example, shared exhibitions, artefact swaps, and uses of new technology to allow important exhibits. Melanie continues.
Art is very political. And I think that's something that people tend to avoid when they're talking about the market and, oh my God, I can't believe people are spending that much money. But the soft power of art has long been really, really wanted, recognised, important.
Paul Roberts at the Ashmolean agrees, but it's not actually that simple, because when it comes to the ownership of art, there are questions about who is legitimate and where does real ownership rest.
With the Parthenon sculptures, the real dilemma you have is that for the Greeks, they are an intrinsic part of Greek identity. For those who support their ownership by the British Museum, they are world identity.
These are complex and difficult arguments. Some argue that but for the expeditions, these artefacts would never have been uncovered in the first place. This in turn is disputed by those who point out that they would have been found eventually by someone. But even that in turn is challenged by those who point out that there are plenty of examples of artefacts that have been found and destroyed by local groups who break them up for building materials, bricks for new buildings, for example, and marble for quicklime. Paul, like Melanie, argues for a much more nuanced set of discussions, anchored of course in international law, such as the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property, but resolved on a case-by-case basis.
The issue of the restitution of objects should be a case-by-case basis, because no two objects are the same, no two countries have the same circumstances. For one thing, you need to get to grips with each individual country's laws on cultural property. There are overarching laws on cultural property to which most countries have signed up. For example, the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property. But each country has its own set of laws, and sometimes they're not very clear, and sometimes they're contradictory. And so it's not always easy for a museum professional to understand the context against which you then put the particular circumstances of this artifact or artifacts.
Art therefore straddles and is connected with many elements of our modern societies today. I am intrigued by its contradictions in this respect. It can become divisive, as we have seen over repatriation. It can contribute towards inequality through ownership being concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest in society. But it also has the power to bring people together and to build understanding in a world where there is too little of that going around. This, surely, is art business for good.
I am a believer in international collections of art. I think that the world has benefited so much from international collections, and at a period when we have so many barriers going up, we have so many divisions, we need that international platform that museums and galleries can provide. And I think it's very important that we nurture that.